It is, wow, Thursday. I should know this because my birthday was yesterday. It is Thursday, June 4th, 2020. I'm talking to somebody I've wanted to talk to for a minute. She's a digital media superstar. She is kind of like an all-in-one all-in-one powerhouse when it comes to media. And just, I think she's on the cutting edge of what the future of media looks like. A lot of it's going to be small teams. A lot of it's going to be creator driven. A lot of it's going to be people who are like my guest in particular, who knows kind of everything. She can write, she can produce, she can do audio. She's kind of all of the things you want. She checks off all the boxes. So her name is Morgan Lee. You may know her from Christianity Today, which is, not, correct me if I'm wrong, Morgan, the largest Christian publication in the U.S. or one
If
of
it's
the
not the
largest.
largest, it's the best, right? Come on.
I like that. I like that energy. All right. So yeah, if it's not the largest, it's one of the best.
The best. I mean, come on, I work there, right? I got to be able to just
like that.
Be loud and proud.
All right. And so with Morgan, the thing about Morgan I think is interesting is that I don't even know how it was either I saw Christianity Today posts or I saw some of your posts on Twitter. I don't know which one I saw first. I can't remember. But I do know is that you, the person, and you, the brand, would like, not necessarily quite the same, but it was interesting to see somebody I could see communicating in real time in like two different languages, which I thought was like, okay, this person's really interesting. Like, I mean, legitimately, I think a lot of social media, there's some people who do really good at social media and they can do nothing else, but you were generally hitting it out the park on everything.
Wow.
Yeah.
First of all, I'm just no one has ever said all these nice things about my work before. And I actually know how we met, which is that I believe that you maybe favorited a tweet on the Christianity Today Twitter account, which is something that I've managed for like the past 3 or 4 years. And I mean, I went to your bio and I was like, what? This guy has so many things that I'm like interested in. One of them being urban planning. I love urban planning. Shout out to urban planning. So I think then I may have responded on my personal account. That's what I remember, to stuff that you said. And then we kind of started following each other on Twitter.
Yeah. So I'm
Something
glad
like that.
No, it's a good follow. And I suggest anyone who hasn't followed Morgan by now, please follow Morgan. What's your Twitter name?
Yeah. So my Twitter name is probably the biggest impediment to my brand overall. A couple years ago, aka back in the days of AIM, I was trying to figure out the most original, as we did back then, original but yet me at the same time way of expressing myself. And I have a very long name, and so I shoved
Please
all
say your
my
name. I think it's pretty.
Okay. My full name is Morgan Emily Pomeakai Akana Ening Lee. So I have taken all those initials and I have made them into my social media handles, which is not intuitive for anyone. God bless you people who find me. But yes, my Twitter handle then is MEPAYNL. And I hope you link to it in your show notes. And I'm sure
I will.
Yeah.
I most definitely will. And, right. And the reason why I was bringing this up is because this week was supposed to be a week of me talking to people who are digital creators and people who want to essentially be one, right? I know some people who want to get into writing as a new business. I know some people who want to get into podcasting. I know some people who just want to increase their social media, not necessarily following, but also like impact. And I was like, I know somebody who does all three of those really, really well. And so I'm glad that you responded to me. And so I want to start out by actually asking this: how did you get with Christianity Today?
So I moved to New York City after I graduated from college. I did a phenomenal leadership program that's called the Coro Fellows Program. We could talk about that a different time.
Okay.
And that program is really good for people that want to get involved in public service, which is another passion for me. And maybe you want to work for the government or for nonprofits. But I had the media bug for a really, really long time. I have just always loved news and meeting people and sharing information with other folks. And so that program, unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, just it didn't have a huge media tie-in. And so I decided to still just take a risk and see what would happen if I ended up working at a place called the Christian Post. And the Christian Post did not require people to have clips or some of the other credentials that often get you into the media world. Clips meaning just basically like digital receipts that you can write or that you can create things, and you send those to people and they kind of get a sense of what you are able to accomplish. I didn't have any of that, and so the Christian Post didn't care that I had any of that, but I knew that I also didn't want to necessarily stay at that publication for in the long term. So I began networking. I lived in New York City, right? And as you and I both know, everyone comes through New York City. Like that's the cool thing about being there. And so I ended up contacting one of the editors. She was the only print managing editor that we've ever had that's been a woman, and I'd followed her work for a long time. And I sent her an email when she was coming to town, and I was like, hey, we should meet up. It would be great to meet you. And we met up. And a couple months after that, she sent me an email to tell me that they had an opening in a residency program, which is apparently, a little bit more than a glorified internship. You're there for a year.
Yeah.
You do get paid, and they will give you the opportunity to get published. So actually, just bringing this back to like everything that's going on right now, one of the first pieces that I wrote was actually in the aftermath of Ferguson starting.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So that was back in August 2014. And that 1 year, of course, turned into many years after that. And I would say I'm very proud, I have to say, to have been the host / creator of our first podcast. And that is called Quick to Listen. That happened in 2016, which was also around the time that I started running our Twitter and Facebook accounts as well.
Right. And so, okay. So now this is where I want to get into this in particular, which is everyone I know has started launching a podcast recently. Right. And so you have done it like you've taken,
come on.
no,
Yes.
you have. And I say that because everyone they're trying to podcast out now. Right. And since you're kind of like an OG in the game, but you're also like very much like still understanding where the marketplace is. Can you explain to people what a podcast is and what the podcast market looks like today?
So one of my coworkers who we just hired to run all the podcasts at Christianity Today said recently to me that like the thing about podcasting is so hard because it's so easy to make a podcast.
This is true.
And I thought that was a really interesting point. So podcasts are essentially very cool in that way. So they have the potential to be far more democratic because anyone is able to upload anything that they make. And you're able to get a podcast on any type of device, right? So most people experience podcasts on their phone, but obviously you can get them on your computer as well, which some people, I had some colleagues recently who said they didn't download podcasts until 2011, and I was like, I think I downloaded podcasts in 2004.
I know that's what I'm saying. Like you're a real OG in this podcast space.
So podcasts can be anything, right? Like it's just like, well, a TV, what can you show on TV? There's so many different genres that are out there that people end up creating and that people are accustomed to. And I feel like in many ways, just like in other media spaces, you can kind of get almost in a genre bubble, I guess, and true. Not even know that there's other types of podcasts that people are creating and so forth. But podcasts can be interviews. We are listening to one right now, right? Podcasts can be storytelling. Podcasts can be a bunch of people on a mic screaming at each other, AKA sports talk radio.
Right.
And the thing about podcasts, though, that I think good podcasts do, right, is that I mentioned a couple minutes ago that it's very easy to make them, right? And so many times people think of podcasts as it's going to be a platform for my passion. And sure, I guess technically a podcast is if you get in front of a mic and you start talking, maybe with someone else, and you end up uploading it and going through all the kind of like requisite steps that you need to maybe edit it a little bit and so forth. But what I think, if you really want to think about podcasts, right? You're trying to create a reason for someone to tune into you on a consistent basis, right? A lot of times that's every single week. And so a true podcast is going to have a hook, right? That tells people this is why you're going to want to listen to it and not just feel like if you have ever wanted to hear what I sound, what my thoughts sound like from my voice.
Right.
Maybe more than that.
Well, I'm glad you said that because I honestly think at some point you're going to have to start teaching people like a course. When you set up the course, let me know. I'm going to hype it up to the end of the earth. So
Thank you. I will, because I'm tired of crap podcasts. No, I'm teasing.
No, do what you want. I like that energy. So I want to ask you then, in case of the podcast space, one of the things I think that I can credit you for is that you've managed to launch a few successful podcasts now. And I think that there's a difference between kind of like a hobbyist, or people who are trying to actually launch podcast careers. And so what would you say to people who want to really launch a career into podcasting?
So there's a couple different things, right? Because there's like the actual content that you're putting out there, and then there's the technical side of things, right? So first of all, just from a technical side of point, I don't want to give people actual specifics because those resources exist, and it's not very fun to have someone name very obscure microphones that you should listen to. But
Right.
obviously equipment matters, right? You're asking someone to invest in listening to your voice, right? And it's important that you're giving them sound quality that doesn't feel grating on them, or like you didn't put some care into the work that you're making. And intentionality is really communicated through audio quality, I would say. And so I think that's important to, yeah, I think that's important to give that to people. Then I would also say, what are you trying to accomplish, right? Again, assuming that it's not just you just trying to record your thoughts for posterity, knowing what you're actually trying to go for.
Okay.
It's okay. Some people maybe feel personally attacked out there.
It's fine. Let them be attacked. Let them be attacked.
But I just feel like you need to know what you are trying to give people. And that may mean, for instance, that you do not need to be on 52 weeks a year. You might decide, I want to educate people. Here's a new passion of mine that I'm really leaning into. I want to educate people on the relationship between Asian Americans and African Americans. Okay. I think that would be best accomplished in a 10-week episode series, right? Or I think that would be best accomplished over 4 months. Or I think that would be best accomplished through 3 different seasons. But even kind of thinking about how much space your podcast is going to take up, then of course there's the time element too, and how much of an investment you want people to make in your time. I will say that I do think that time connotes different things, right? For some people, they might say like, wow, I remember, so I host a podcast called Quick to Listen. Quick to Listen is a news podcast, and I mentioned it earlier, we launched it in 2016. And I would say the first year that we recorded, King, a lot of our episodes were like 20 or 30 minutes. And at one point, one of my coworkers was like, why not go to like 50 minutes? He's like, it's a podcast, right? Because it's not radio, right? We don't have other constraints that are going on. And I have to say that was one of the things that has elevated the podcast so much more, right? Because we're going so deep. And the podcast is called Quick to Listen. And part of the hype of it, right, is that we are going to give you a context-based show, right? We're going to go into the history. We're going to like let our guests talk, right? My podcast is not really like a banter podcast, for instance. It's about like, I want to get people who are experts and wring literally as much of the information that they have out of them,
right?
And do that in a way that educates our listeners. And then I would just say the last thing is that the best podcasts have segments, right? And so a lot of times it can feel a little bit monotonous, I would say, if let's say that if you just hit one note the entire time. That note could be really beautiful, but it also limits how people are experiencing you, right? And because podcasts in many ways are like hyper relational, right? Like, I don't know about you, King, but like I have friends that I've never met, but I listen to their podcast, so I'm friends with them, right?
I like that idea. But a lot of people feel that way. So I definitely know what you mean.
I mean, they're speaking in my ear, so we're friends.
It is.
So, but with regards to that, what is the cool thing about relationships? Well, it's that you have seen them in different spaces, right? And so again, going back to my podcast, one of the things that we do to do that is we have a segment at the end called Precious Moments, which it's a little bit tongue in cheek.
No, I like it. I listen to the show. I like it.
But it's also a way to give you a personal investment in me. You hear my voice if you listen to the show every single week. And I don't want to just, for the sake of this, right? We're not just trying to say like Morgan's like this interview host, but maybe you would find some gratification from hearing about things that are important to me at that time, and then being more curious as a result about when I'm asking questions, right? I want to hear what Morgan's going to say, or whomever, right? Mm-hmm. So there is a personality element that you do want to shine through. And I do think, again, segments are about intentionally letting that different parts of your personality shine throughout the show.
I like this. See, look, you're going to be the teacher of everyone now. So I'm really happy for this. And so actually one of the things I do want to ask you in regards to the like everything about, I feel like I could talk to you 99 years about this. But no, one of the things, all right. So one of the things about podcasts, I think that people are just starting to figure out is that while you might yourself, Morgan, are a all-star, you are pretty much like a industry resource on podcasts, there's still a whole swath of people who have no idea what a podcast is. So how do you always keep that in mind? Like, no matter how you've done, I don't know how many hundreds of episodes at this point, but knowing that there are millions of people who've never even aware what the format is in the first place.
Are you talking about with regards to finding guests or about potential people that might stumble upon it?
Yeah, potential new audiences when it comes to that.
That's a great question. So audio is a really interesting medium because in some ways you have to be more didactic or explicit about things that you are observing or seeing, and looking for ways to specifically flag things that are happening using audio, right, is not necessarily something that's intuitive to folks, right? That's not necessarily how we communicate. That's not, for many of us, our natural language to be like, well, I feel a change in mood, so I will now change the song on the stereo to reflect that my mood has changed, right? We don't go around our houses doing that to indicate that to our family members, so maybe we should, right? But on podcasts, that's a big way that you do that, is you use noise, music, sounds, your voice to bring people along, right? So I'm going to mention another podcast that I've been working on. So we launched a podcast back in March called All Alone. This is not related to Christianity Today. This is me with some folks at an organization called Useful Group. And All Alone is essentially crowdsourced stories that people are sharing about how they're experiencing the pandemic. And King, announcement to people, we're going to broaden it, and we're going to make it about how you're experiencing 2020. We just had a meeting.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And it's going to be a little bit broader because I think this year is going to be a year that we really see a seminal.
Yeah.
But that's a side note.
Okay.
So in that podcast, we are cutting usually between two different people's stories when we're doing that. Okay. So it's going back and forth between people's voices, and we use music to indicate those cues. Or because these stories that people are giving us are sourced from my questions, right? So I send people out 5 questions once a week, and then they're answering them, right? There's times, right, where people are moving from one theme to the next. And so then we will put music in the background, right, to kind of indicate like, oh, this is a different thing, right? So in text, right, you might have a paragraph break, or you might have a section header, right? There's ways that you tell people this is going to be a little bit different than what you have seen earlier.
Right.
And you just have different signposts, but those signposts are really important, right? Those signposts are what we use, again, in print to help people stay engaged, right? If they feel like they're losing focus, there's something that's going to be in big, bold letters. Well, again, you can't necessarily do that in the same way in audio, right? Because you're not reading something, but you can, use music and sound effects to do that. And I think it's really important that we, provide that experience and those signposts for our listeners.
See, like, you're just a wealth of knowledge. And so, no, I'm asking this as well because the state of podcasts today is, I think it's a lot of people think that we might be at too many podcasts. I actually think we're the opposite. I think we're actually going to see a big growth in that, especially as more people stay home and as just more people start to figure out new ways to like either communicate with the world and get information out. And with that said too, how do you manage to keep the podcast that you have so on like focus? Because of the way the world is, like, it's easy to get off focus. It's easy to be in a completely different space 2 months from now, but your podcasts are always very, very focused. Like, how do you do that?
So again, that goes back to our question of like what you're trying to accomplish. Mm-hmm. And it also helps have someone else listen to it.
Okay.
So I'll talk about the other podcast that I launched during this time for work. It is called Prayer Amid Pandemic. And essentially we are telling stories of Christians whose lives were shaped by sickness or illness. And then there's a segment where we include prayers from folks all around the world. And there's also a segment too, which contains coronavirus news. So I just want to talk a little bit about how each of those segments are about, 1, the pandemic at large, and 2, faith, right? I'm putting this out on behalf of Christianity Today, right? And it is supposed to be specifically tied to the name, right? The name in many ways is what's grounding each of those 3 segments. Mm-hmm. Now, I will say that, King, it is not always easy to stay on target, right? So for instance, there have been a couple stories that we have told. These are stories that we're telling of people who lived hundreds of years ago, or sometimes maybe like in the past, there's a couple people that are still alive that I've like interviewed about this type of thing. And I was getting some feedback from someone who listens to the show a lot, and he was just telling me like, no, this podcast really does the best storytelling when the people whose stories you're telling are, excuse me, when they're specifically linked to the pandemic. Mm. And, you know, I kind of wanted to make it about sickness more broadly or pain more broadly. And I don't think that broad stuff necessarily is as gripping to people. It's not as compelling as people. There's plenty of people who have dealt with chronic pain over the years, and those are not bad stories to tell, I think. But this podcast is mostly, in the name, people are expecting to hear a story about a pandemic. The same person also gave me feedback about this news section, because I originally was thinking, oh, I'll give people coronavirus headlines. And he told me very specifically, like, shouldn't these be about church? You know? And I think that has made that segment actually a really good segment, because King, there's no way that I would be giving people actually coronavirus news broadly that they couldn't find in more detail on a different site, right?
Good point. Good point.
And it would be also far more recent. But you better believe that I'm spending like 2 hours or 3 hours sometimes hunting down stories to go in there every week and then consolidating them and rewriting them to give that news. And people are not, I guarantee you, most people have not heard the stories before, or a lot of them that we've heard during that news section. And so having that very specific lens, right, makes that valuable. So when you're asking, like, how do you stay narrow? I think that you should not be afraid of narrow. So many times we think, oh, but what if we don't get to include that or don't get to include that? Yeah. Well, a lot of this goes back to audience too, right? Your audience often feels more seen when you are more narrow in what you're talking about, right? Because they come there because they feel like, oh, I'm connecting with this in this sense. And they are hoping that the host and producers and so forth are also going to be as curious about that particular topic as they are.
Right. And I like that too, because you're just giving good concrete facts. And I think that's why like the CT podcast do so well. And I want to bring this back to CT for a minute, because CT is an older organization. But if I'm like, you know, if I'm looking, okay, I'm a 30-year-old, I'm just checking out what CT is. I wouldn't know that it's an old organization based on just the podcast aspect of it alone. It feels way more contemporary than it should. And how do you manage to be something that's new and relevant for a new generation within an older existing publication?
I think that's a question that we often are asking ourselves, you know, and I've been fortunate for the past couple of years to get to work in specific parts of the publication that there's no playbook that's written about how to do these things the right way or the CT way, right? And what I'm saying is not to at all incriminate my own organization. Obviously, there's all of us who work for different outlets, right, or different institutions. There's particular levels of excellence that are needed, or a voice that is needed on a particular topic. And I guess to some extent, the tone part would be something that I think is consistent across our brands. You are not going to find people who look like they're yelling on my podcast.
No, it's very like calm and civil, and I like it. It's almost like refreshing.
Yes. So we're either a throwback or we're the harbinger of something new. I don't know, but that's that is kind of the energy that we bring into spaces. And I would say that energy is like relatively consistent with the type that I bring onto the show, right? But for instance, the pandemic started a couple months ago, and I had been trying to organize a Twitter chat for a very long time and had failed, essentially. And so I remember just asking a question on Twitter about, you know, what's everyone doing for church this week? I believe it was something like that. And then I'm getting 200 responses, and I posted on Facebook, and I got a similar number of responses. I got people from about, I want to say like 30, 40 countries around the world who answered these questions and shared about where they were from, which that to me, that was also really cool, because I know our audience is global, but I don't always hear from them in the same ways. And many times when I'm on social media, I'm writing to more of an American-ish audience, you know, knowing other people will read it. Though I will say one thing that I've said the entire time, all my posts that kind of ask these very open-ended questions, because now I've had a number of them, say, hi CT friends. And I wanted to make them broad. I'll tell you specific ways how I address them. And I'm not saying this is the best way to do it. I haven't gotten concrete feedback, but I said hi because I personally prefer greetings like good morning, good afternoon, you know, good evening, things that kind of again, are going to be more time specific. But if our audience isn't necessarily located here, I didn't want people to feel that we're reading it from another country, you know, that it wasn't for
Yeah.
them. So I used hi instead. And then I didn't want to use subscriber either, right? Or
Okay.
readers, because I know that tons of people come across these things who aren't necessarily in either bucket, but I still wanted them to feel welcome to participate in this type of thing. And friends, I think, is just, you know, warmer language than people who read our stuff. Hi, people who
Right.
like our
Right.
Facebook page or whatever, you
That
know.
yeah, that's very true. Well, no, I mean that's the thing about, and I'm glad you kind of segued into that, which is it's hard for me to explain to sometimes to people that there's a difference between writing on the internet and like writing for a publication. And can you explain that to other people, because those really are two different skill sets?
So when you're writing for a publication, a lot of times you are on your home turf,
Mm.
right? Yes, we've all been in this case where an article from a publication we hadn't really heard of was floating around the internet. You read it, you were offended. How could they write that? I can't
Yeah.
believe it. So tone deaf. Chances are that publication made an assumption that they were writing for a particular audience. And chances are that audience was not you. And those are the rare instances, right, in which something that, especially now, right, with how our news feeds are often very curated,
Hmm.
where something kind of like bled past that, right? But when you're writing for a publication, in many ways, there's the expectation you need to write a lot for the people that you deem as your readers. So Christianity Today, who do we see as our readers? We would say CT sees as our readers Christian leaders, right?
Okay.
That can be broad,
Hmm.
widely interpreted, but that's kind of how we've understood our audience to be and how we're going to edit accordingly. I would not say that that is true for the people that follow us on Twitter or on Facebook, right? There are so many reasons why you would follow us on Twitter and Facebook that have nothing to do with you feeling necessarily like at home on our pages or not. You know, for instance, Christianity Today, that's the name of it. There's
Hmm.
people who just are trying to figure out more about Christianity, right? So they're writing about this, or so they end up following us. There's people who just want to kind of keep tabs on the Christians, you know? They're we've all been there.
Yes. Yes.
We just follow people to kind of
Yeah.
like, what are they up to? You know, well, anyway, it's very broad, right?
Hmm.
And things can get wildly misinterpreted, and people are far less willing to give you the benefit of the doubt when something happens on social media as they are when you're writing for your publication, right? So I would say that to some extent, things have to be a little bit more general. Now, it's you're trying to balance two things, right? Again, you don't want to speak so generally that people are kind of like, I consider myself a Christian, but this doesn't make any sense to how I'm experiencing the world or processing things. But it does mean that, you know, you can use some of the maybe like more insidery jokes or language or touchstones that other people may not know, that are not necessarily your core readers. So it's a balance. But you are obviously on social media having to be cognizant that far more people are going to be encountering your stuff. And also, you know, I don't think we do this inconsistently in our pages, but sometimes it's also just nice to break the fourth wall. So in many of my posts, I would say they're kind of like summaries of what people's arguments are. But as some people may remember, King I'm sure definitely does, we had a big piece in December where our editor-in-chief called on
Yeah.
folks to remove Trump from office.
That. Yep. I remember that a lot.
So I ran social media that weekend or that week after all that happened, right? And the piece, when it went up, crashed our site essentially.
Really? Okay.
It did. Not
Wow.
for that long. IT was able to get stuff back and running, but our servers had not been prepared for that moment. And so the thing blows up, people start reading it, and then people are like, where is it? Right? And so I started replying on the CT account directly in the comments, telling people it was up again and resharing that link again, you know, and just basically acknowledging them, saying like, I see you exist. I know you're wondering where the article is. Here's a link to it. So there is almost kind of like a customer service role or liaison that you end up playing too sometimes on social media.
Yeah. And so you kind of jumped into it, which is CT sometimes does get into controversy. And so I think that you're one of the few people who understand what it means to be in the controversial space on every single medium, because I think the controversy does play itself out differently on social media than it does in print, than it does in like the email or the podcast world. Can you talk to people just what that means when you have to deal with controversy?
I would say that it's challenging right now. Almost every single piece that we've been running in the past week has attracted people who have strong opinions about it, right? There's either people that are like, praise the Lord, CT is speaking out on this. And then there are folks who maybe just watched a recent Candace Owens video and now have
not mine.
have some corrections that they would like to make to our piece, or nuances that they would like to add. And figuring out how to navigate all of that is very different. And it really honestly depends on the medium, right? I would say in many ways, it's a lot easier to, based on the configuration of Twitter, it's a lot easier to ignore people who end up disagreeing with you when you're running a corporate account. I'm not going to speak for the hazards of your own account, and especially the sting/bite that trolls can really take out. But on a corporate account, yeah, it's a little bit easier to not feel like you need to block people in the same way. Facebook is very challenging to navigate.
Yes, it is.
And because I think of how the algorithm works, I think there are sometimes people who have maybe not seen earlier positions that we've taken on things. And so at some point, a position that they are unhappy with migrates into their feed, and they feel some type of way about that, and it's not reflected beautifully on our page. Sometimes I will try to read through the comments and end up banning anyone who is spamming our site, or who is being very hostile. I try not to ban people at all that are just disagreeing with us, but the line between troll and disagreement sometimes is not very clear. I also sometimes we get Facebook fans who tattle on other people, and to be honest, like that's actually helpful, because it's hard to police everyone.
Okay. And so when you mean by tattle, because all right, I want to be clear, because some people who listen to this, for the last 2 or 3 months, I'm putting all my podcasts on YouTube and YouTube only, because I kind of want to see what that community is like. It doesn't move the same as if I put it like on regular iTunes or something like that. But I think that a lot of people who listen to my stuff also have Facebook accounts. Can you explain to people what that like experience is like when you have to deal with tattletales on just Facebook in general? Because I don't think the Facebook audience understands how the rest of the internet fully operates.
I'll explain what I mean it to be, but you should tell me what you think it means too. So what I get is we get messages to the CT inbox, the Facebook inbox, that say this person is out of line in how they're acting on Facebook. Then I react to that, and I usually try to find that person. I got to be honest, that we have more than 450,000 likes on Facebook, and so in the Facebook user or like interface, you're supposed to be able to like search the name of people that like your page and then act on them accordingly, whether you want to ban them or unban them or so forth. Basically, I think that they probably hit a number and it like overwhelms the search thing. So unless I know what post that person had been essentially acting out on, it's very hard for me to end up kind of like disciplining them or removing them from our page. And I really just like do ban people a lot, because Facebook comments can get so dicey so quickly, and I feel like most people know intentionally what they're doing.
This is true. Yeah, and that's I was gonna and to answer your question, which is I'm kind of in the same boat, which is I've had to manage other people's pages before. And for that same reason, because like you said, Twitter, I think is just built for text. So in general, I think that's why like people, when they tweet something out or like uploading like an article, it moves easier. But the thing about Facebook is I think the Facebook audience, they expect the way they receive information on Facebook to be the way that something is written. So what I mean is this, like there was, I'm not going to say the account, but there was something I was managing for just not a long time. I'll just post like a video like, hey, this is about, X artist. It wasn't anything crazy, but they were like, why doesn't it operate this? Because it's really a YouTube video that is like literally just uploaded from YouTube back to Facebook. And so they were kind of trying to make it act like a Facebook video. They were trying to figure out why it doesn't do X, Y, and Z. And like their consumption was just not the same. And so I see that a lot more on my end. I don't see it on yours because you have probably millions of people who are sometimes commenting on things, and that could just be out of control.
It can get out of control really quickly. You know, I'm not interested in shutting down comments though. And
Yeah.
in general, we usually have a number of people who end up trying to fight the good fight in Facebook comments. I will say, so there are times where I will actually maybe jump into the comments. It is not consistent, right? But
Hmm.
so people who are listening to this are aware that a couple nights ago, President Trump walked to a church. And on this walk that he took from the White House to the church, had been a number of protesters there who, whether or not they were tear gassed, had some sort of gas that was spread into the area, that dispersed the crowd. And it felt very violent to most people who watched this particular situation. And so yesterday we had a piece where the American Bible Society, which is basically what it sounds like, a Christian nonprofit that supports the Bible, that particular group put out a statement responding to that. And so I shared, obviously, this article that we had where the American Bible Society responded to that. And the clip made it clear, or the text that I put for that Facebook comment, I think made it pretty clear, that the American Bible Society was the one that was responding to this. However, that was not at all what our Facebook commenters said. And so I had a number of people applauding CT, which CT was reporting on something. We did not comment on what President Trump did, or dissing CT when that was not that. And so I did just jump in the comments as CT and I said, hi, just so everyone knows, this is a reported piece on a statement put out by the American Bible Society. I have no idea how many hearts and minds that changed, King, but you know,
Right.
I thought it was also important to make people clear too, like, even especially for the people who were like trying to praise us, like, this is not at all what this is. Like, yes, we do publish editorials, but that was not that.
Right. And so I'm glad you kind of brought that up because recently, unfortunately, I think that I've watched how you've had to manage some really thorny issues. And I think that it's the good thing is it's not really because you're the one producing thorny content. It's just like thorny content is just intersecting all the time now with CT, almost like on a daily basis. It feels like it does. And I mean, I think, and I bring that up because how do you feel? And this is my opinion, not yours. I think that CT is one of the few places on the internet that generally does media right, digital media right. But also I feel like you're one of the few places where still there's a certain level of civility of people from different walks of life who normally would never talk or agree with each other. How do you manage to keep all that together, knowing like where the society is as a whole right now?
So one, I'm sure that I'm not perfect at all. So there are people that I retweet where I'm positive that if you retweet and you say something in a way that I agree with more, I'm more likely to retweet you than people I'm not. Like, and I'm not just saying like, and I just like want to be clear that like there's a very human element in all the types of stuff that you're doing on social media, right? Like it's hard to just kind of sit back and be like very unbiased in how you're touching on things. I will say that an area of feedback that I've gotten on from my coworkers and that I've tried to address in how I'm doing things is to be careful about just not picking like a one line from an article that does not necessarily give itself over to like the spirit of the whole article, right? And guess what? I love engagement. So there were times definitely where like I was like, that's the most interesting line they put in there. So don't I want people to talk about it? You know, but that's really not appropriate to the editors, right? Who spent a lot of time trying to contextualize that line or that argument. And it also just, you know, trying to bait people to engage is not a really responsible way to do a lot of this type of stuff. So yeah, people blame Twitter all the time for being a thing that's like not great for context. You know, listen, we are like what at 280 characters. You could provide a little bit more context these days. Like, it's not either or. The last thing I will say is that Christianity today, in many ways, tries to be broad in terms of like how we view. Well, tries to be broad in our newsroom, right? But I would say everyone there does rally around one idea, a lot, which is this idea of, how do I say this? Really treating people who disagree with you as respectfully as possible.
I do see that in the pieces that you have.
So I just think about our previous editor-in-chief all the time, who told me that when someone that doesn't agree with the argument that is being made in a piece reads that piece, they should be able to see their argument for what it is. Like, they should be able to look at that and identify that and say, like, yeah, that's like what I generally argue, or that's what I generally stand for. And that when you are engaging other people's ideas, you need to take the cream of the crop of their ideas and disagree with those, and not just the worst ones, and take it at bad faith. So
Right.
to the extent that I can, that's the type of energy that I would try to bring in a social media space.
Right. And so now I want to bring you to something that's super dicey, super thorny, and kind of in the vein of that, which is why there's no way to escape it, right? So we have this issue of coronavirus, we have an issue of protests, we have an issue of rioting, we have an issue of unemployment. All these things are happening at the exact same time. Because it's going on so much, and Christianity Today literally hits, I think, basically every state, every community in the United States kind of has like some CT readership. How have you been seeing how that's been playing out in the readership of it, like of what you guys have been, or the listenership have you been posting about?
So we published a piece last week about George Floyd, and this piece was written by my coworker, Kate Shellnutt. Kate, before she came to Christianity Today, actually worked for the Houston Chronicle. And while she was at the Houston Chronicle, I believe she attended an event where George Floyd was actually at, and that many ministry leaders were at. And so something really cool came together, where essentially her connections, I think through social media that she saw from Houston, who had done ministry with George Floyd, were posting about that. And that kind of tipped her off to like, oh, there might be a larger thing there, and a deeper story to tell about who George Floyd was based on these ministry leaders. And so she interviewed them last week, and then the story went up last Friday. And that story will probably be one of our most read pieces of the year. And it's gotten a very diverse and broad response with regards to who is sharing it and who is reading it. And as far as I know, I haven't really seen any kind of comparable coverage at all, looking at the life of George Floyd and the legacy that he left in this community in Houston. And I think that piece is complicated, right? King, I wanted to read to you one of the lines that someone actually said in the piece, because I think part of its popularity is a challenge to all of us. And there's a line in there from one of the ministry leaders that says, "The fact that you have to build a narrative for a man to be loved and given justice is repulsive to me." And that's just something that I think a lot of us have to sit with as journalists, right? That these are some really positive stories that we have of who George Floyd was. If you read the story, particularly, it talks about how these ministers and pastors were trying to reach young people in disinvested neighborhoods and so forth, and how George did a really good job connecting folks there, right? And so that's kind of the story that we're telling, right? But there's also this hunger that I'm sure many of our readers have to find victims who are perfect, right? Or who fit a certain level of like character standards that they're looking for. And that once we find someone who does that, it becomes easier to rally against their unjust death, right? And so, I'm not surprised that a story like this, as excited as I am that we can tell George Floyd's story, and I really think that that's a net positive overall, I'm sure there are folks that are also sharing it, right? Because, well, how dare we kill this type of person, right? As opposed to the fact that it doesn't really matter if you did something good or bad in your life. No one deserves, right, to have someone's knee on their neck for 8 minutes, right?
Right.
So that's something I think we want to continually challenge people with too, even as we're excited that people are reading about that. And that's why I'm glad that quote shows up in the story too. And I hope people sit with that.
Okay. And I want to ask you now also, Morgan, which is, we're almost at the first half of the year, and CT, I'm assuming, has had engagement at an all-time high. What is next for CT for the rest of this year?
That's a great question. I want to just flag one thing that kind of happened alongside of our coronavirus coverage, which was that we have been building something called CT Global
Mm-hmm.
through, relationships, partnerships, grants the past couple of years, and it is what it sounds like, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is an effort to engage the global church at a much bigger level and to figure out how to tell their stories more and also get more readership, right? And so we actually have stats that come out every week that kind of give us a sense of like what percentage of all of our content has been read by a US audience versus the rest of the world, right? So the one area that we have completely transformed how we're covering things is with regards to language, right? And so we had a piece that came out at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, not in the US, but in the world, in China when it was still there, by a woman whose grandparents lived in Wuhan. And she was writing about how Martin Luther responded to the plague back in the 1500s. And it was a little bit of a slow drip with regards to COVID when it was, when it moved from Wuhan to the United States, right? And that gave us enough time to figure out, like, oh, maybe it'd be great if we could get this into Chinese. Oh, if we're going to get this into Chinese, do we have capacity for both traditional characters and simplified characters? What's the IT build up that we have to do? Who is able to turn this around in time? Whatever. But the pandemic has lasted. And of course, again, this was back in January and February. We've had stuff coming out about it for nearly 6 months right now.
Yeah.
And so it's given us time to really connect with other readers. So we've used different technology to essentially reach out to people who are reading our stuff and give them the opportunity to connect with us around translation. And we have had pieces, I want to say, in 9 different languages, right? Which is
Nice.
incredible. So anything from Indonesian to German to French to, like I mentioned, Chinese earlier, Spanish, Portuguese, and so on and so forth, Arabic as well too. And a couple of those things take extra lifts when it comes to the IT part of it. But that's really exciting, and I don't think that's going to slow down anytime soon.
I like that. And I actually, before we get off, I'm glad you gave me some time to talk to you. I don't know if anyone knows by now, but seriously, Morgan is also a very avid baseball fan based on her tweets. I know, right? And so I got to ask you, it seems like baseball may be coming back this year. Maybe. If it does, this is a baseball related question. Who's winning the series?
Who's winning the series? Great question. Do you think, if it's 2020, don't you think the Astros are going to win? Just so we can really just like have had the craziest year ever.
Everything about this makes sense.
Right? Like the Astros were I think I tweeted about this recently where I was like, remember when we all hated the Astros? Like, I have to just say, like, that storyline feels so pure right now. Like,
yeah.
A great cheating scandal. Sorry, Dodgers fans. A great cheating scandal involving banging on trash cans. Like, love the conspiracies. Guys, one of my favorite I love conspiracy theories around baseball. One of them was about the fact that they were like buzzers in Jose Altuve's jersey that tipped him off to hitting the game-winning home run last year. Anyway, it was so enticing, and I really just like lost myself in that scandal for a really long time. And I, the guy who is supposed to manage the Astros this year is Dusty Baker, and Dusty Baker won the World Series with the Giants. I'm a Giants fan. Back in 2002, and unfortunately, Dusty just has a reputation of not being able to get the deal done, like of taking teams further than they've ever gone, but he has no rings to show for it. So the Astros hiring Dusty Baker was such a punk move because now you feel like, do I want the Astros to win?
Yeah.
And also, they also was a punk move because they only signed Dusty to a 1-year contract, which is ridiculous. So if this year finishes with no baseball, which could definitely be what ends up happening, Dusty will be denied because of not just a pandemic, but because of greedy owners. Anyway.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to put a pin on that. We'll talk in 6 months to see what happens with that one.
I'll just be happy if baseball's back. I will be okay if the Astros win.
It's coming back. It'll be like 50 games or something.
Okay. Let's do it. Let's do it.
So, all right, y'all. Her name is Morgan Lee. She is seriously a digital media pioneer. I would suggest Morgan, at some point you do just the straight up digital course on podcasting and digital media as a whole. I think you have two lanes. You have the digital course for podcasting and you have a digital course for media. I'm telling you this, not putting this in your ear. You could do it. Yeah, you're the most talented person I know in this field. Please look at Christianity Today. What is your Twitter account for Christianity Today?
So Christianity Today's Twitter account is at CT Magazine. And my personal Twitter account, I won't rely on King to know. Good.
Okay.
For everyone having to remember all of it. It's MEPAYNL. If you see me online, I have my Hawaiian name in the middle of my name. So Morgan Pomeakai Lee. That's why my full name is there. So,
all right. And one last thing I ask all my guests, Morgan, which is what's making you happy?
Wow. Interesting question right now. I would say, honestly, the same thing that's made me happy for a really long time, which is just, as weird as it sounds, my legs. I have been running so much during the pandemic and more recently going on really long bike rides on the weekends.
Nice. Okay.
And there's nothing like just moving, honestly, moving that just fills me with joy. I love getting outside. I love my neighborhood. I love this is a whole different podcast, but my like running around King is phenomenal. I get to go through 2 different parks and some really beautiful boulevards and see the west side of Chicago. And I just also love being on my bike. I'm happy when I'm on my bike. It's a great place to be. So
all right,
that's
cool.
what makes me happy. Yeah.
I like that. And once again, y'all, Morgan Lee, I cannot stress how great she is enough. If you haven't already, make sure you follow her. I'll put it in the show notes. Once again, if you haven't already, please like and subscribe wherever you heard this podcast from. And once again, I am King Williams, your host. You can reach out to me on all social media at I am King Williams. So at I am King Williams on all social media. And if you haven't already, please sign up for my newsletter at iamkingwilliams.substack.com. Thank you very much.
His newsletter is great. You should get it. Thank you, King. It was so fun.
This was fun. All right. Later.
All right. Bye.